央人民广播电台。现在播送中国共产党中央委员会关于无产阶级文化大革命的决定，1966年8月8日通过。一、社会主义革命的新阶段。当前开展的无产阶级文化大革命，是一场触及人们灵魂的大革命。
As we arrive at the 60th anniversary of the May 16th notification, the foundational document that officially launched the Cultural Revolution, historical and political discourse inevitably begins to swell. A full sexagenary cycle has passed since 1966, an interval that in traditional Chinese timekeeping signifies completion and renewal. Yet, contemporary discussions surrounding this immense historical event often fall into traps of oversimplification, reducing a decade of profound social upheaval into easily digestible, albeit deeply flawed narratives. We must begin by dismantling these inadequate perspectives to clear the ground for genuine understanding. One prevalent view frames the Cultural Revolution as a straightforward, protracted coup orchestrated by Mao Zedong to regain political supremacy after his marginalization following the Great Leap Forward. To understand the profound inadequacy of this framing, we can look at an actual historical coup that shares this exact date. The May 16th coup in South Korea, marking its 65th anniversary this year, was a textbook military takeover. In 1961, General Park Chung-hee and his military factions executed a swift, top-down seizure of the state apparatus. They immediately installed a rigid, hierarchical command structure to stabilize the nation, enforce order, and drive industrialization from the top down. The events that unfolded in China were fundamentally different in nature and execution. Mao did not rely on the military to swiftly arrest his rivals in the dark of night to restore order. He unleashed a bottom-up mass mobilization of unprecedented scale, actively encouraging citizens to completely dismantle the party and state bureaucracy from the outside in. He desired chaos, famously declaring that there is great disorder under heaven, and the situation is excellent. Treating a decade of nationwide ideological warfare, the fracturing of society into warring civilian factions, and the total restructuring of local governance as a mere palace coup ignores the terrifying agency handed to and violently exercised by the civilian populace. Another common perspective is to view the era as a pure, unmitigated tragedy. Qualitatively speaking, at the end of the day, the Cultural Revolution is clearly a tragedy. Millions of people suffered immensely, families were torn apart, priceless cultural heritage was decimated, and the national economy stagnated while the rest of East Asia modernized. That said, such a view is too simplified to understand the whole historical event. This sort of view is normally developed with an obsessed focus on the visceral details of enormous historical events, which fails to provide any academically valid conclusion. When historians or commentators fixate purely on the horror of struggle sessions, the public humiliations, or the chaotic violence of rebel factions, they often abandon structural analysis. The tragedy transforms into a historical black box, an era treated as an outbreak of mass collective insanity. This prevents us from understanding the underlying sociological mechanisms and rational incentives that drove ordinary people, students, and workers to such extremes. We cannot learn from history if we allow our analysis to be paralyzed by our own revulsion. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there is a growing tendency, particularly among disillusioned Chinese youth facing modern economic anxieties, to view the period as a romanticized solution. Facing immense pressures from a hyper-competitive job market and stark wealth inequality, some look back at the era as a time of true egalitarianism, high social mobility, and pure anti-capitalist struggle. Even in some points, the Cultural Revolution is not a total failure. It is clearly not a ready-made solution for current societal antagonisms. Historical reality thoroughly contradicts this utopian vision of a harmonious, unified working class. By the end of the decade, the Chinese populace was profoundly exhausted, cynical, and deeply disillusioned with endless ideological campaigns. The 1976 Tiananmen incident is effectively against Mao, which could at least prove that back then, people were not satisfied with it at all. During the Qingming Festival, thousands of ordinary citizens gathered in the square to mourn the passing of Premier Zhou Enlai, laying wreaths and reading poetry. They used the occasion to implicitly and explicitly protest the radical policies of the Gang of Four and the overarching, exhausting chaos of Maoist continuous revolution. This mass protest, which was violently suppressed by police and militia, was a clear signal from the grassroots. The people were desperate for stability, completely debunking the modern myth that the era was a golden age of proletarian solidarity. I am not in any sense justifying all those cruel struggles which consist the Cultural Revolution, but it is important to note that we mustn't simply allow emotional anathema to disturb actual analysis. This analytical clarity is important for preventing similar events from emerging again in the future. To achieve this goal, I believe, we should give equal attention to both historical reality and theoretical abstraction. To move beyond superficial readings, we require a brief overview of the theoretical and pragmatical basis of the movement. Understanding Mao's motives requires stepping into the framework of Marxism. In Western political discourse, Marxism is frequently demonized and reduced entirely to authoritarian state control. In its original theoretical form, Marxism is essentially a structural critique of power. It examines how those who control the means of production extract value from those who do the actual labor, creating an inevitable class antagonism. Mao applied this Marxist lens to his own government and arrived at a terrifying conclusion. He observed the Soviet Union and saw that after eliminating private property, the state bureaucracy had assumed total control over all resources. These officials used their administrative power to grant themselves special privileges, better housing, and superior healthcare. Mao identified this phenomenon as the rise of a new bureaucratic bourgeoisie. Even without formally owning factories, these officials acted exactly like the old capitalist class, extracting the surplus value of the workers to enrich and insulate themselves. This theoretical revelation collided directly with Mao's precarious political situation in the early 1960s. Following the catastrophic failure of the Great Leap Forward, which resulted in a massive famine and tens of millions of deaths, Mao was forced to retreat to the second line of leadership. Pragmatic administrators, led by Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, took over the daily management of the economy. To save the country from starvation, they implemented policies that tolerated small private agricultural plots and piece-rate wages in factories. From Mao's perspective, these pragmatic recovery measures were the exact seeds of capitalist restoration. He watched the party apparatus become increasingly rationalized, bureaucratic, and insulated from his ideological decrees. He genuinely feared that the Chinese Communist Party was rapidly transforming into the very bureaucratic bourgeoisie he despised in the Soviet Union. His motivation for launching the Cultural Revolution was a complex synthesis of a genuine ideological desire to save the socialist project from bureaucratic decay and a deeply personal ambition to shatter the state apparatus that had dared to sideline him. We arrive at two main questions regarding the ultimate legacy of this decade. To what extent does the Cultural Revolution fail? And to what extent does it succeed? To answer the first, we must examine the actual historical progression of the movement and the catastrophic administrative paralysis it unleashed. The process officially began in May 1966, targeting key cultural and political figures in Beijing. Mao quickly bypassed the party structure entirely, empowering millions of high school and university students to form Red Guard units. He explicitly authorized them to attack old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. By August, the movement turned violently physical. Students beat their teachers, ransacked historical sites, and humiliated anyone deemed a class enemy. Schools and universities were shuttered, and millions of youths used free train travel to exchange revolutionary experiences across the country. By early 1967, the movement escalated far beyond cultural vandalism into the violent seizure of power from local and provincial governments. In the January storm in Shanghai, rebel worker groups successfully overthrew the Municipal Party Committee, attempting to establish a radically democratic system modeled on the 1871 Paris Commune. This inspired similar power seizures nationwide, resulting in the complete collapse of state authority across massive swathes of the country. With the old bureaucracy shattered, rebel factions immediately splintered. Each group claimed to be the sole authentic defender of Mao Zedong thought, and they turned their weapons on each other. During events like the 1967 Wuhan incident, armed conservative factions backed by local military commanders openly clashed with radical rebel groups, bringing the nation to the absolute brink of full-scale civil war. In cities like Chongqing, rebel factions raided military armories, deploying artillery and anti-aircraft guns against rival civilian neighborhoods. The military eventually had to intervene to forcefully restore a basic level of administrative order. This intervention often resulted in massive, bloody purges of the very radical mass organizations Mao had initially empowered. To defuse the explosive energy of the urban youth and clear the chaotic cities, millions of students were subsequently exiled to the remote countryside to perform hard agricultural labor. The later years of the era were defined less by mass mobilization and more by elite political maneuvering and paranoia. This culminated in the alleged coup attempt, flight, and death of Mao's chosen successor Lin Biao in 1971. This bizarre event shattered the absolute ideological faith of countless citizens, plunging the nation into a weary, cynical stagnation until Mao's death. When analyzing the failure of this period, mainstream commentary naturally focuses on mass death, economic chaos, the destruction of antiquities, and the severing of basic human trust. All of these are undeniable, horrifying historical facts. I believe, however, the most profound failure is that the movement completely failed to actually create a new governing order or a viable governing reproduction cycle. The most important idea of cultural revolution was that people could achieve better social equilibrium by constantly criticizing and replacing party and government officials. This was an extreme trial regarding high social mobility, representing the most developed state of Mao's campaign-style governance. The vision was to establish a society where the masses held a permanent, institutionalized veto over the bureaucracy, ensuring leaders remained terrified servants of the public. The execution of this idea resulted in total administrative paralysis. The new institutions created to replace the old government, primarily the revolutionary committees, quickly became dominated by military men and rehabilitated old cadres. They simply replicated the previous hierarchies but with significantly less competence and vastly more violence. The constant threat of ideological purges meant that any form of practical, forward-looking administration became impossible. Doing actual work was incredibly dangerous, as any policy decision regarding factory production or educational curriculum could be retroactively labeled as a capitalist deviation by a rival faction. Only if we adopt this analytical point could its failure showcase the most tragic element, which is far more tragic than those common conservatists reproof towards the death toll. The true tragedy lies in the permanent ideological scar it left on the governing philosophy of the Chinese state. This absolute failure effectively constructed and cemented an elitist narrative. If you allow grassroots citizens to gain political power, you cannot possibly have a well-governed society. The absolute anarchy of the decade provided the perfect empirical ammunition for those who opposed democratic empowerment or independent worker organization. It solidified the belief among the surviving political class that the masses are inherently irrational, prone to mob violence, and entirely incapable of self-governance without a strong, authoritarian hand guiding them. Such is exactly the logic behind the ruling practice of Chinese elites after the Cultural Revolution, from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping. The post-Mao consensus among the ruling class was built on the absolute prevention of uncontrolled grassroots mobilization. Stability became the ultimate, unquestionable justification for state power. When students and workers gathered in Tiananmen Square in 1989 demanding political reform and protesting corruption, party elders explicitly compared the demonstrations to the chaos of the Red Guards to justify a military crackdown. Any demand for political participation from below is immediately associated with the terrifying specter of societal collapse. The tragic failure to build a viable democratic alternative to bureaucracy during the Cultural Revolution essentially immunized the modern bureaucracy against all future democratic challenges, locking Chinese society into a rigid authoritarian framework. Identifying a success within such a catastrophic period requires a profound shift in perspective, moving away from the immediate historical outcomes to the broader theoretical implications. In the world-famous comedy, Yes, Minister, Season 1, Episode 1, there is such a dialogue between Sir Arnold and Bernard.
But what's wrong with open government? I mean, why shouldn't the public know more about what's going on?
Are you serious?
Well, yes, sir. I mean, it is the minister's policy, after all.
My dear boy, it's a contradiction in terms. You can be open, or you can have government.
Here, Sir Arnold gives us a concise epigram. Open government is a contradiction in terms. You can be open, or you can have government. We could find a very similar structure in the leftist narrative regarding a successful revolution. Of course, they do not inherently contradict each other in pure theory, but as we learn from brutal history, the successful sense of every revolution tends to subvert itself. After a revolution succeeds in overthrowing the old order, the rebellion inevitably becomes the new ruling class. The social hierarchy updates its form, adopting new revolutionary titles and rhetoric, but eventually remains perfectly intact. This new entrenchment thus inevitably creates the exact same class antagonism required for the next revolution. This cyclical trap is exactly where we shall find the successful part of the Cultural Revolution. Its success virtually comes from its monumental failure. Mao recognized this iron law of oligarchy and attempted to break the historical cycle by launching a revolution against the very revolutionary apparatus he built. He provided a remarkably accurate sociological diagnosis of what a vanguard party is destined to become once it monopolizes absolute political power. It takes almost no effort for one to grasp the dark irony of the subsequent decades. The primary reason Mao launched the movement was his absolute conviction that bourgeois elements had infiltrated the government and society with the aim of restoring capitalism. For 10 years, the entire country tore itself apart trying to root out these supposed hidden capitalists. Yet immediately after Chinese elites finished the Cultural Revolution, surviving the purges and regaining their posts, they proved his central thesis entirely correct. With the help of an exhausted people desperate for better living standards, Deng Xiaoping pushed open and reform, effectively and systematically restoring capitalism in all but name. The prophecies made by radical theorists during the 1960s were fulfilled almost to the letter. The party officials did indeed transform into a new bureaucratic bourgeoisie. During the massive privatization of state-owned enterprises in the late 1990s, millions of state workers were abruptly laid off, losing their lifetime employment guarantees, housing, and health care. Meanwhile, government officials and well-connected factory managers leveraged their unchecked political power to purchase these state assets at fraction of their value, instantly accumulating vast private wealth. With the tragic logic we pinpointed before regarding the sheer terror of grassroots mobilization, this restoring process was rigorously accompanied by severe suppressing of Chinese proletariats. Rural communities were marginalized through the household registration system to supply cheap, disposable migrant labor for the booming coastal megacities. Any attempt at independent labor organization was utterly crushed to ensure an attractive, docile environment for foreign manufacturing capital. The state utilized the trauma of the past chaos to justify a highly surveilled, deeply unequal present. The elites learned that to maintain absolute power and simultaneously embrace global markets, they had to completely neutralize the political and social agency of the working class. Eventually, the end justifies the means. Economic growth became the sole metric of legitimacy, purchased at the direct cost of the egalitarian ideals the state was ostensibly founded upon. This trajectory is exactly the reason why Chinese citizens start to romanticize the Cultural Revolution today. Young people looking back are not necessarily yearning for the blood in the streets or the dogmatic poverty of their grandparents' generation. They are looking at the stark realities of contemporary society, characterized by immense wealth disparity, crushing corporate work cultures like the 996 schedule, and a deeply entrenched, unresponsive bureaucratic elite. They recognize that the diagnosis made 60 years ago regarding the inevitable betrayal by the bureaucratic class was hauntingly accurate. They are reclaiming Maoist vocabulary to critique their modern billionaire employers and the state apparatus that protects them. The movement succeeded as a grim, prophetic sociological diagnosis of the vanguard party's destiny. It exposed the undeniable, fatal contradiction between a ruling elite and the masses they claim to represent. The proposed cure nearly killed the patient, leaving a legacy of violence and trauma. The devastating accuracy of the underlying diagnosis remains a powerful, lingering ghost haunting the modern political landscape, proving that while the revolution failed in practice, its critique of entrenched power was entirely successful. We must finally confront the overarching elitist conclusion drawn from this history. I shall start with a profound protest against the current conservative intellectual consensus. Maximizing the happiness of all people is indeed justifiable and is only possible by the pursuing of true equality. We cannot allow the disaster of the 1960s to trick us into accepting that vast wealth disparity and authoritarian control are the natural, unchangeable states of human society. The failure of the Cultural Revolution is vastly more to blame for its strategic execution instead of its basic egalitarian idea. The strategic approach of the movement was clearly too ideological. It completely ignored actual material production. You cannot feed a nation or build a prosperous society when factories halt assembly lines to hold daily struggle sessions, or when agricultural planning is dictated by political slogans rather than scientific realities. Furthermore, the movement omitted a basic human fact: we all make mistakes. The assumption that the oppressed masses possessed an inherent, mystical political wisdom was fatally flawed. Overthrowing corrupt or bureaucratic officials does not immediately make the resulting rebellions capable of complex governance. Running a municipality, managing a logistics network, or balancing an economy requires specialized skills. Giving a teenager a red armband and a mandate to rebel does not suddenly imbue them with administrative competence. In any case, class solidification is clearly not a just goal. The Cultural Revolution taught us that extreme mobility, where society is locked in perpetual chaotic warfare, is catastrophic. It is equally true that the extreme ossification we see in modern society is a profound injustice. We must not become cynical and accept the current hierarchy simply because the historical alternative was violent. To break this binary between chaos and oppression, we must point out a most important aspect: education. What contemporary Chinese elites are trying to do, and have probably already achieved, is to systematically bleach any substantial political content from school curriculums and social practice. A glaring historical example is the constitutional revision process. The freedom to strike was explicitly enshrined in the 1975 Constitution during the late Cultural Revolution era. However, in the 1982 constitutional amendment, steered by the newly consolidated elite class, this fundamental right of the working class was entirely deleted. The political awareness and subject initiative of individuals do not flourish simply with their birth. These qualities require a huge amount of academic training, historical awareness, and actual social practice. By bleaching the mechanics of political participation, labor rights, and structural critique from public education, the modern elite ensures the masses remain atomized and docile. They ensure that if the people ever do become angry enough to mobilize, they will lack the theoretical tools to build a better system, virtually guaranteeing another cycle of mindless chaos. Real progress requires recognizing that a just society depends on teaching citizens how to govern, not merely demanding that they obey.